I heard in verses why they're just really well structured.
All right, today we're going to talk about Sun opposite Saturn, with Saturn being retrograde. Now, as we have progressed inward from Pluto, we have seen the orbital revolutions diminish quite swiftly. Pluto, as we said, stays in the sign 21 years, and since generations are around 20 years, it was truly a generational planet. And then Neptune stays in the sign 14 years, which is 2/3 of a generation, and Uranus stays 7 years, which is only 1/3. So by the time we get to Saturn, its orbital revolution, the whole business is 29 years. And so Saturn stays in a sign about just shy of 2.5 years. And so it's about 1/9 of a generation. So 2.5 years cannot realistically be considered a generation at all. So we have to talk about Saturn differently from the way we have spoken about the other planets, about the octave planets. This is the first concrete planet working inward from the octave planets. So let's look at that. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can begin to understand Saturn and the frustration that it represents. For instance, you could study it in relation to Mars, both in people's lives and historically. Because of the speed of Mars, its orbit is just a little under 2 years. But in those 2 years, Saturn has moved forward a little bit. So usually, Saturn forms a conjunction with twice in a sign with Saturn. And looking at the differences between one and the next is a very interesting relationship. But we want to do something else. I want to do something altogether different from what we have looked at it now. I want to look at something very classic. And I don't know how to say it. Let's look at what is called the ladder of the stars. The ladder of the stars unites two completely different kinds of astrology. Both involve the planets that we see in the heaven, but the ladder of the stars sees the current material manifestation of the solar system as part of something much bigger. It's part of a subset. It has much more to do with the very large creation. Now, the type of type of astrology that we have been doing, and will do later on again in this talk, is based on the apparent positions of the stars and planets at a given time as seen from a given position on Earth. The other type of astrology is based on the qualities of periods of time according to the rulers of those periods. Now, in this type of astrology, which has been called revolutionary astrology, or sometimes it's called Chaldean revolutionary astrology, there are planetary periods within planetary periods within planetary periods. The range of this kind of astrology is mostly unknown to me because it's mostly esoteric. Now, the ladder of the stars is geocentric, but it's a structure that's different from the astrology that we normally see. Oh, I've lost my position. So, all right. we're looking at a geocentric astrology, and what we're talking about is the ladder of the stars and a totally different kind of astrology than we practice. Max Heindel uses some of it, but very little. The rungs of the ladder of the stars reach from the earth deep into the heavens. And they are determined according to the zodiacal speed, the average zodiacal speed of the planets. So obviously the moon is the swiftest of all of the astrological significators or planets. So the lowest rung on the ladder is the moon. The next is Mercury, and then Venus, and then the Sun, and then Mars, and then Jupiter, and Saturn, in that order. Now, it's normally stated in such a position, if you look at the older Rosicrucian ephemeruses, in following the form of Max Heindel, it goes Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, in a rotating sequence. And the reason for this order has something to do with involutionary and evolutionary activity. It has also to do with the descent of Christ to the earth, and a whole lot of other things that are much too big for us to go into. This basic sequence of the stars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, is something like a musical scale. And by accentuating different parts of it or different rhythms in it, it opens up one to many different spiritual activities. Now, the entire solar creation is accomplished through simple principles. We talked about that last night in the evening talk. 7 simple principles in form and the same principles in time and in revolution, so that we have globes and periods and revolutions. Now, if we look at the different rhythms that you can use to understand this sequence, there are many, many of them, and they're fascinating. And they're the key to a lot of different things. Like if you look at Paracelsus' listing of the table of the metals, they are a variant of this sequence, and that variant is a key to understanding alchemy. Now, as far as I know, there is no open exoteric exposition of this kind of astrology. Almost nobody even talks about it anymore. The most common use of this kind of astrology in our time is the way Max Heindel used it. That is in planetary hours. Now, in planetary hours, the day begins at sunrise. And a planetary hour is 1/12 of the time from sunrise to sunset. And that's a diurnal planetary hour. And a nocturnal planetary hour is 1/12 of the time of the period between sunset to the next sunrise. Now, this means that the length of the planets varies according to the season of the year. And it varies according to your location on Earth. And so it's not a simple astrology in that way. So if we take the first hour of the day after sunrise on Saturday, and say that is a Saturn hour, the next one will be Jupiter, the next one will be Mars, and the next one will be Sun, and it goes through that sequence. And when you get through all 24, the first hour on Sunday will be ruled by the Sun. So this is a system that has been known for many millennia. Now you may want to ask, how do you determine which day is which to begin with? And there are 2 ways that can be done. If you're clairvoyant, it's just a matter of looking. One is traditional. For example, in Jewish religion, the Sabbath has been very accurately kept for thousands of years. So there are some tribes in northern India that also keep these cycles. The other way is by observation. You don't even have to be clairvoyant. If you look at the light on Sunday, the light on Sunday is different than it is from every other day of the week. And because the sun is so strong, it stands out more clearly. So that Sunday is, you can always find out what is what. And so you could recreate this whole system from observation by yourself. Now, it becomes very, very complicated. The planetary hours are a sub-cycle of the planetary days. And according to the relationship to the moon and the sign of the zodiac the sun is in, there are planetary months. And if you look at the structure of the zodiac relative to this sequence of Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, you see that the entire zodiac and the months of the year are tied into this same sequence. Now, there is a book that is said to be by Saint Germain, and this part of it, I believe, really is from Saint Germain. He gives the denominations of the years, like there's a sun year, a Venus year, a Mercury year, and he goes so far as to say that there are 35-year periods. And looking in history, I have found periods that are about 350 years in length. And so there are always cycles within cycles and spirals within spirals, and you can follow this all the way back to where it hooks up with the precession of the equinox, and you then see it in a very large sense. And in the largest sense that we work with, this takes us all the way back to the different periods of the cosmogony. The Saturn period, the Sun period, the Moon period. So there are cycles within cycles within cycles. As far as I know, there is no known knowledge of the exoteric of this system of astrology. Now, Rudolf Steiner claims that this ties actually into the orbital revolutions of the planets, and he gave hints or suggestions of how you could trace this into the so that you could align the two astrologies together and see how they function together. As far as I know, there was a British mathematician named Paul Allen and another man who was an astronomer that spent their entire life trying to figure it out, and they were not successful. It has to be kept secret. Madame Blavatsky says of this that it is so secret that she can't even tell you why it is secret, because the reasons for the secrecy have to be kept secret. So it's a fun thing. In terms of spiritual lives, the ladder of the stars is a kind of a ladder of apotheosis. In a sort of a fashion, it shows us the steps of spiritual attainment. The moon is the lowest step, and the moon represents our biological nature. And we overcome our biological nature first, so that we are creatures of animal instinct. The next step is the Mercury step. Max Handel tells us quite clearly that it's fairly easy to get in control of the concrete mind because it's so young and it's yet unformed, and you can get its control more easily. The third step is the Venus step, and it represents getting a control over the desire nature. And the fourth step is the Sun step, which represents self-mastery. The steps that are beyond the sun, the Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, represent mastery, represent being able to deal with things that are beyond our personal existence. Everything from the sun down, coming from sun to Venus to Mercury to the moon to Earth, those are all personal things. And the personal things we can overcome, but the things that are about the world outside of us and beyond us are not so easy to overcome. So Saturn, which is what we're talking about today, is the final rung on the ladder. So Saturn is the gatekeeper to the realms beyond concrete existence. Those realms in one of the Greek mystery schools were 3. And you see it in those pictures where that man, you see all the rungs of the ladder in those pictures where he's reaching through to the stars. That's reaching to the transcendental side of things, beyond concretion. And those orders were, again, proceeding outward from Saturn, the firmament, the crystallium, and the primum mobile. The firmament was the realm through which the stars, as specific light sources, focus into all of the concrete realms. And it relates to the human spirit. And the human spirit reflectively projects itself into the desire world, which is where astrological forces work. The crystallium was a sphere of spiritual light so dense that it was seen as a crystal made up of light, not transmitting light, but a crystal made up of life. And that corresponds to Christ the rock, which is perfectly apt since this is the realm of life spirit. The primum mobile means first mover. And sometimes it is referred to in spiritual literature as the unmoved mover. And obviously that is the divine spirit in which everything else moves and changes. Now, in the modern philosophy of the Rosicrucian order, which we study through the Rosicrucian Fellowship, the worlds are denominated according to the nature of their substance and of their function. Like the desire world is called the desire world because it is where our desires are found. So that's a different way of looking at things than the way of looking at things with the Chaldean order. However, that doesn't nullify the effect of the Chaldean order, because you can find that in play in many, many things in nature. You could spend your whole life, or probably several lives, finding the meaning of things through the relationship with this sequence of planets. Now, as we soon experience when we try to live a spiritual life, we don't have the luxury to be purists so that we can take one step at a time and be done with it. Life has to go on, and we have to work on many things simultaneously. Max Heindel tells us that we can work on making our dense physical bodies clean and healthy, and that makes all of the other lessons or all the other rungs on the ladder easier to take, but we still have to do all of the other things at the same time. So it's like that with the ladder of the stars. Even though you may be most advanced in controlling your biological nature as the first step, at the same time you have to be working on all the other realms. Saturn is the last rung on the ladder before entering the transcendental worlds of the gods. I believe it's in Simplified Scientific Astrology, Saturn is the gatekeeper, and the gate is called the gateway to chaos. Max refers to that in relation to Saturn and Uranus. In this sense, the last rung of the ladder is clearing all destiny. That means stepping beyond cause and consequence, which is a really very high thing, so that we can function in the realms beyond which cause and consequence don't work, or we are the agencies that put things into cause and consequence. We are not locked into cause and consequence. Saturn rules Capricorn, and it is exalted in Libra, which is the scales of justice and the scales of the law. Now, Saturn has that whole quality. You do things to the letter of the law. And Saturn recognizes the law as a tool for creative activity. And if you learn, or as you get to the Saturn rung of the ladder, you use destiny as creative feedback and not as something that keeps you in line. However, for most of us, we have to be kept in line. Saturn is a planet of ignorance. And we are often ignorant of our destiny when it comes back to us. We put out causes and we forget about them. We become ignorant to them. And when those causes become consequences and they come back to us, we don't even recognize them anymore. And that's a very good thing. Because if we get the trial of destiny returned to us and it comes to us in blind, and we can pass and not make the same mistake that we made when we put the destiny out, that we have moved forward in that. So it seems in our ignorance, destiny is fulfilled in ways and times when we least expect it. Now, the principle of consequence is also the principle of action and reaction. If you are in a rowboat and you try to step onto shore, you have to be careful, because the action of stepping forward moves the boat back, and very quickly you end up in the water. And that is a perfect example of how action and reaction work in a physical world. It's a good way to learn something. It's not, I've gotten wet a few times. You can't do, in these worlds, you can't do without action and reaction. And so, if you're trying to get around destiny or to avoid destiny, is something like trying to box with a mirror, because everything that you do, the mirror does. And that's often what Saturn in an opposition is like. So we're talking about Saturn in retrograde opposite to the Sun, and it is facing head-on, right across the beam from yourself, Saturn, and its destiny is coming back to you. Because of our ignorance, and because of the fact that we shirk a lot, and because we don't like to face our destiny, Saturn is a frustrating planet to a lot of people. I once had an astrological student that wanted to build a cannon to knock Saturn out of the cosmos. So having Saturn opposite the Sun is facing destiny. And Saturn is retrograde, and it comes back to us. It is kind of an ugly reminiscence, something that you did wrong and now you have to face it. Saturn in our consciousness, because of ignorance and because of our lack of appreciation of it, and because we aren't careful about how we live, Saturn is something like a blind spot. And when it comes back, its function is something like a boomerang. So we're saying that Saturn opposite the Sun, which Saturn has to be retrograde if that's the case, is boomerang destiny. It comes back at you and comes back at you and comes back at you. That's not an easy thing. I can remember the first time I encountered a curve ball. I was in high school. I was going to try out for the baseball team. And we had a pitcher at that time who had what was called a roundhouse curve, meaning that he threw a curve that really curved a lot. And so I'm at bat, and I see this ball coming right at me. And so I duck. But I duck right into the plate, which is where the curve went. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but remaining in ignorance and not being waked up by having our destiny come back to us is far more unpleasant. So this unpleasant things that Saturn does are important. All right, now we're going to start looking at some Saturn-Sun retrospect horoscopes and how some people dealt with it. Now, this is a very hard aspect, an extremely hard aspect, so this may not be a pleasant time. Now, there is an old maxim that we hear all the time that says, money can't buy you love. And this is the horoscope of the famous poor little rich girl. She was the heiress to the tobacco fortune and had a very, very sad life. Now, this is not an easy horoscope to talk about in these brief little things that we're doing here, because there are so many interlocking aspects, and each one contributes something different, and you have to be aware of so many things going on. We're talking about love, so Venus is on the cusp of the second house. And Venus is... all right. Venus is opposite to Pluto. But Venus is trine to the moon. And the moon is sextile to Pluto. That's called a 30-60-90 triangle in mathematics. The moon, which is trine to Venus, is also square to Uranus. It's square to Uranus in the second house. And so that there's almost no planet in the chart that isn't involved with an aspect with another planet, which is really a nice thing, because for every time a planet is activated in your chart and there's an event in your life, you have options, and you have options that turn on the same point. So the Sun also forms a sextile with Uranus. And the Sun, as we're studying it, is opposite to Saturn. And Saturn is trine to Uranus. That's another 30-60-90 triangle. This is a really, really complicated life. She had the Uranus in the second house, shows that she had skill. She took the fortune that was given to her, and she magnified it. And by the time she died, she was worth $1.3 billion.
Oh my God.
Yes. And the family fortune, the Duke Foundation, which is behind Duke University and things like that, she ratcheted that up to $53 billion. Neptune is in the 8th house. And Neptune is trine to the Sun, and Neptune is trine to Mars. The 8th house is the house of inheritances, and abstractly the 8th house is ruled by Scorpio. That's in abstract. And Scorpio is the nastiest sign in the zodiac. In all the years that I have worked with people and with horoscopes, I have never seen such nasty, inhuman things done by people as when they try to manipulate someone in order to get an inheritance. I've seen a sister have her brother disinherited. There are all kinds of stories I could tell, but that's the 8th house is the house of inheritance, and she had the inheritance with this Neptune trine the planets in the 8th house is more than just money. The Sun, the Neptune trine to the Sun and Mars gives her a kind of strength, a spiritual strength or a spiritual energy. And she needs that because of the Sun opposite Saturn. Saturn, when it comes back at the individuality, it really knocks you down. And it produces insecurity and inadequacy. Sun opposite Mars indicates frustration. And the Saturn being opposite both of these planets are masculine planets. So in her relationship to men, she's in tough shape. She's in a mess. Now Jupiter is rising in its own sign in Sagittarius, and it conjoins Mercury. And that indicates an outward nature that, is pleasantly sociable, and she was a likable person. If you were to meet her outwardly, you would think that she was fine. But inwardly, we find somebody that is filled with guilt and things that come from the past. The 12th house represents ripeness of destiny from past lives, not necessarily the immediate, but whatever is ripe from all of your past lives comes in through the 12th. And Scorpio is the sign that where you're most likely to feel guilty about something from your past. Now the combination feels, with Saturn involved as it is, it feels as something inevitable is pressing on her and keeping her from being outward like she would like to be in the world, and to be with a man as she would like to be with a man. And it indicates, the 12th house is a retreat, but sometimes the 12th house is an escape. And she can't escape into money because money doesn't mean too much to her. And because there's a nasty T-square between Uranus, Moon, and Neptune, and that indicates that her emotionality is screwed up. And to add to all of that, the Venus is square to Pluto. And that usually means love compulsions. So she feels compelled, and she falls obsessively in love with people, and not really in love, but in need, in emotional need with people, and she obsesses about them, and she wants a counterpart, but because of her relations with men being as they are, she is always frustrated in that. So it's a tough life. The way it works out is very fascinating. Her first marriage was to a man who was 16 years older than her. which is not uncommon if you have a strong Saturn in your chart. This is a pretty strong Saturn, less than a degree of orb from opposite the Sun. And according to one biography, which had access to her wedding night was sexless. And the next morning, her husband asked her what his annual salary was going to be.
Why didn't she just stab him right there?
What?
Why didn't she just stab him right there?
She didn't get much sex from him, and she didn't get intimacy of any kind from him. So she escaped into extramarital affairs. And she had a fling with Errol Flynn, the movie star who had many, many lovers. And then there was a Hawaiian swimming champion that she had an affair with. And she even had an affair with a parliamentarian from Britain. And from one of them she conceived a child. But the child only lived 24 hours. And eventually she understood that her husband was using her, so she bought him out. Often people who marry someone older for their first marriage marry someone younger for their second and later marriages. And so what she did is, this time she was smarter. She made a premarital contract, and she married a man who was a legendary Latin lover called Porfirio Rubirosa. I'm sorry. And they divorced a year later, but because they were so sexually compatible almost all the rest of her life, they had liaisons. And then she had an affair with a Mexican jazz pianist who was temperamental, and she threw him out. When she ordered him out of the house, he slugged her in the jaw and broke her jaw.
Oh my God.
It's a hard life. And then she had, this is another thing that happens when you have a lot of problems with men, have a lot of problems with women, or woman has a lot of problems with men, they seek out homosexuals just to have companionship. And so she had a relationship with a gay man from Morocco who was a set designer, and that didn't work out. And he tried to take over her affairs. And finally, if a person is really messed up, they end up being a Hare Krishna. And she had a Hare Krishna who convinced her that he was the son that died the day. And so she adopted him. And he promptly tried to take over all of her financial affairs. And she had been told as a child that no one will ever love you. Everybody will want your money. And that then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because she has all of these self-doubts, and they keep coming back, and obsessively she wants a partner. But the partner tries to come in with power, and it repeats itself and repeats itself. It happened all through her life. So it was a boomerang kind of life. She never found somebody who really loved her. So despite all of her business savvy, and she was extremely charitable, and she had all kinds of healthy hobbies and things like that, she felt herself, her life was a failure. Yeah, I told you it's going to be a tough day. Sun opposite Saturn isn't an easy day. Now, in this case, I do something that's almost forbidden in astrology. I'm using a chart where the exact time of birth is not known. And so we're doing a noon chart. And you use a noon chart because it gives you the best possible probability of having the moon correct if a person, you give them a time of birth isn't at noon. Francisco de Goya. Everybody knows who he is. One of the things this illustrates is, remember I've been talking almost every talk about the square representing the right-hand rule and the square being very constructive. We have a hard time dealing with it as human beings, but it's very constructive. Now there are 3 planets that represent visual imagination. And those 3 planets are Moon, Neptune, and Venus. All 3 in this chart are square. And unless she was born very early in the morning or very late, unless he was born very early in the morning or very late at night, this square would have been in effect. So this is somebody who can build through imagination. We've said that everything in the universe is built by the square. Now, he has all these planets in Aries, which indicates this is somebody who's really bold. This is somebody who painted nudes when it was forbidden to paint nudes. In fact, the famous naked Maha, he had to paint over and put a dress on her. But at any rate, he was very bold. The Saturn is also opposite to Venus, as well as it is opposite to the Sun, and as well as it is opposite to Mercury, and it is square to the 2 planets in the 12th house. This is a pretty bad horoscope to deal with. Anytime we set out to create something, we try to go beyond our personal limits. We try to go beyond that last rung of the ladder into the creative transcendental planets. And Saturn doesn't allow that. And something in our nature, if we want to be one of the gods, we have to overcome the world. And Saturn, in that kind of an instance, represents the world. It blocks the way. And there is such a thing as painter's block as much as there is writer's block. But painter's block is not as strong because it draws on the right hemisphere, and the consciousness in the right hemisphere is more fluent. Whereas if you're writing, you're working with the left hemisphere, and in the left hemisphere you're breaking things down word by word by word, and you don't have that fluency that you have in painting and drawing and right hemisphere activities. But he did have painter's block. The Sun, opposite Saturn, he doubts himself. It begins with denials to your individual independence. And this is a man with all these planets in the 10th house. He is a man that sees the world, the larger world, the societal world. And for him, the realization of human limitations, which included himself, began with the Iberian Peninsular War, which is called the First War of Spanish Independence by some. It began when Napoleon invaded Portugal, and then Napoleon invaded Spain. And it was a very vicious and a very bloody war. And if you ever look at some of his paintings, he paints the violence, the Aries kind of consciousness. And he didn't lay back. It was really naturalistic. And he showed it all. The war persisted. And Saturn never gives up. And the society he loves was overcome by Napoleon. And it was at great cost. But through the success of that, when Napoleon was forced to retreat, was the first step in Spanish independence from monarchy. And but everything of this affected Goya. And Saturn is a planet of darkness. And if you look at all of the late paintings of Goya, they're very dark. It's called the black period of his life. So this is a perfect example of Saturn pushing back, and it's coming from deep down in the fourth house. So it's coming from the personal unconscious or the personal subconscious, and there's a lot of despair and depression and things like that. All right, let's quickly look at another. These are quickies, because this time we have a little bit better data. It isn't perfect data, but it is acceptable data. With Tim here, we have to have at least one Brit in every class. We do have one Brit in every class. All right. Saturn is retrograde in the fourth house, opposite the Sun, and it's really strong, something like 25, 30 minutes from being exact. And the fourth house usually, for the past few centuries, usually represents relations with the father. If you read through Messages of the Stars by Max Heindel, you can see that he clearly considers the fourth house to be the house of the father. And Saturn denies. And when Coleridge was a very, very small boy, he was about 6 years old, his father died. And when that occurs, psychologically, one of the effects of that is that people grow up, especially boys, having fantasies about their father, which he did all of his life. He carried the fantasies. The 10th house, in the cases where the fourth house represents the father, the 10th house then represents the mother. The mother was married another man, and the man didn't like him, so they packed him off to some kind of a boarding school or something like that. It sounds almost Dickinsonian, but that's what happened. And so he didn't have intimacy with his mother either. So what often happens in such cases is people marry someone to have family. But the 7th house has Pluto in it, and it's square to the Sun, and it's square to Saturn, so we have a big honking T-square here. There is a 30-60-90 between Jupiter with Saturn, and there is a trapezoid in that the Mars is there, so there's a lot of positivity. But the positivity worked out in his profession. He was an extremely respected scholar, critic, theological thinker, and of course a poet. And those things are shown in the 10th house, but as a professor and as a scholar, it's the 10th house. His commentaries on Shakespeare are some of the very best I have ever read. He really got Shakespeare well. And it's clear. But still, he was lonely, and he was isolated, and he was forlorn. And he could have been physically active. Wordsworth befriended him, and he could have taken walks with Wordsworth, but he somehow denied taking physical activity. Because if you take physical activity, you can work a lot of that crap out, and it doesn't bother you. So all of his dark destiny kept coming back at him, and he went into depression. And the T-square with Pluto and Saturn, with those being dark planets, and with the orbs, the T-square was stronger than the trapezoid, so he went into depression. And the way he went into depression, now this is a remarkable person for to have this happen. The way he dealt with it is to take the Neptune square the moon. His health was failing, and he started taking laudanum, which is a tincture of opium. And he took more and more. And for a long time in his life, this is almost unbelievable, for a long time in his life, he drank 2 quarts of laudanum every day. In fact, his famous poem about he loved the pictures. See, he'd get into the trance-like state, and he would see the pictures inwardly. And he loved that. One of his most famous poems is a description of what happens under the influence of opium. It's called Kubla Khan. You remember it, Ela? Can you recite? I can bring some of it to mind. In Dada, Kubla Khan, a stately treasure dome did, where the river Alf runs, I can't remember it all. Do you remember it? Oh, how can you be there? Here we have a Brit that doesn't remember. All right. But what happened is, it's never enough. So he kept increasing his dosage of laudanum. What it was, he felt sorry for himself. And for a Leo to feel sorry for himself is an extremely rare thing. I think I have seen it once in my life, and that was somebody who had an extremely strong conjunction of Saturn and Pluto and the Sun in Leo. And it produced a whipped Leo, and you don't ever see a whipped Leo, but that was one of the cases. So he kept increasing his dosage of laudanum, and eventually his whole health broke down. Now we have to deal with one of the hardest emotions that humans can go through, and that is to love someone and to be rejected. Doris Duke was, she had people that didn't really love her, and she was used for love, but to be rejected is very, very hard, and this is somebody that was rejected. I suppose we stand up and it's easier to do. Okay. I don't want to take cheap shots at the president, but I will.
Please feel free to do so.
I will give some of the facts. She was divorced by the president, who wasn't president then, because after having 3 children, her body didn't turn him on anymore. She didn't always appear glamorous to him. And so she was rejected. And it wasn't always that way. At one time, she was a world-class skier, and she was a fashion model, and she held a master's degree, still has the master's degree. So she was a jet setter, and she was almost forced into that. That's the kind of character, where Saturn is, and where if Pluto's there also, is someplace that you have to be in life. I have Saturn in the 7th house, and I had to be married at one time. No, it wasn't a shotgun marriage, but you couldn't avoid it. There's a T-square of Sun conjoined Mars with the Moon and with Saturn. That's a pretty big hunk of planets. This is not an easy life at all. There's a toughness because Mars is in it, and Mars is opposite Saturn. Saturn tries to depress, but Mars won't allow it, and it explodes and it fights back. But there is a limit to how much she can fight back because she had that Saturn opposite the Sun where she doesn't think well of herself. And so when she settled with Donald Trump, she got a settlement of less than 1% of his ownings.
Oh dear Lord.
And in the struggle, she got more, but it was only 2%. She fought. And she was a fighter. She had a second marriage. Where do I have her second marriage here? No, I don't have it listed. But she fought with her second husband also, and there were a lot of court cases in it and things like that, and she won. But she brought up the children to be fighters. That Aries quality, that's where the Mars works out. The Saturn doesn't work out there. Saturn works out at other places. Saturn works out in the second house, which is difficult. That house indicates both a lot of money and not a lot of money at the same time. So the kids grew up to be fighters. We see them now in the White House. They're fighters and probably have too much authority for their abilities, but that's something that's not ours to deal with. So with her positive aspects, she did pretty well for herself in fashion, and she had a cosmetic business and things like that. And she had a third marriage with a toy boy. It only lasted for a few months, and again there was a battle. Now she also has Venus opposite Pluto. And that is that eternal kind of love. And it is not always healthy. It's obsessive. And with what I think happened here is that even though she has been rejected by Donald, if a person is obsessive and they're denied the fulfillment of their obsession, it only makes the obsession stronger. And so we get the feel of the whole character with the Sun, Mars being pressed down and coming back stronger. The love obsession is even stronger. And my take on all of that is that she probably is still in love with Donald Trump, and she has legal agreements that she can't say anything, and it's one of those things. If he weren't such a schmuck, he might eventually have to come back to her because he would know that she really loves him. Now, on two periods in my life, I used to hang out with the folkniks. And one of the folk singers that was a dear friend was a folk comedian. And I still communicate with him. He lives in, what's that city at the tip of the bay? Where all the yuppies are.
San Francisco?
No, the other end of the bay. Oh, well, it doesn't make any difference.
Seattle.
What?
Seattle.
San Jose.
Oh, San Jose.
San Jose. And he told me once that when he does a set of songs, he never ends with a blues song. He said, because if you do a blues song and you do it really well, he said it does bring the audience down. And he says they don't come back for the next set. And if they do come back, you don't have them anymore. They've gone to a different place. And he says sometimes they don't come back to the next performance. So with that in mind and realizing that we're dealing with Saturn, I decided to end up with a positive horoscope, even though we're going to have almost nothing to say about astrology. The next horoscope is somebody who knew Donald Trump when Donald Trump was a little boy, and who was also a friend of Richard Nixon. Does everybody know who Norman Vincent Peale is? He was a minister, a very positive minister. Now this is a great horoscope because this is one of the few horoscopes that I've seen that a person got significantly beyond his stars. And Max would love it. In this horoscope, the Sun is together with Pluto in the 12th house, which is really hard. And it's opposite to Saturn, so there are abundant opportunities for self-doubt. And he has a destiny of having to deal with people of power. So it's really heavy. Now, beyond that, there are not a lot of aspects in this chart. There is the Jupiter sextile Uranus, and there is the Mars sextile Neptune, but they aren't really very effective because they are all between outer planets. And if you have an aspect where both planets are outer planets, it's not as effective as if those same planets aspect one of the internal personal planets. So what we're saying is we have an extremely strong dark force focusing on his individuality and on his identity with not much outside to take away. Now, we know very little about his life because he was a private person. But what it was that he was one of the first ministers to become involved with psychology. And he partnered with a psychiatrist, and they would counsel parishioners. The psychiatrist would deal with the psychological issues, and he would deal with the issues of faith. But along the way, he began to preach and publish the power of positive thinking. Almost immediately, all the psychologists and psychiatrists distanced themselves from him. He became a 12th house exile from the people that he was growing through and that was learning through. And then came all of the polemics against him from every corner. Some people said, this is self-hypnosis. And others said, this is psychologically dangerous. He did make a mistake in saying that Kennedy shouldn't be a president because he was unfit for the presidency because he was a Catholic. That was a serious mistake, and that indicates the kind of bias of the Sun conjoined Pluto. But everybody came out against him. And then he started talking about God not as a person, like a man with an old beard or anything like that. He began to talk about God as a spiritual force. And then the theologians came out against him. And they claimed he was an atheist and that he was an anti-Christian. In short, he became a pariah to everyone. People of every stripe came out against him. The politicians were angry with him about Kennedy, and everybody was down on him. And so he had all of this boomerang destiny. It was all coming back to the 12th house. And when you have Saturn involved in the 12th house, it's very hard to escape. And so this is what happens when Saturn and people squelch, and Pluto people squelch you. And is something like a 12th house destiny that is like the life of Job, the oppression of the mighty. Now what happened is he continued to preach positivity. And all of his adversaries didn't watch what happened. His followers didn't suffer any psychological trauma, and they weren't afraid to live, and their faith increased. And he didn't say there wasn't any evil, as his distractors said. He just said that, yes, there's evil, but there is darkness, is the word that he used. And he said, but you look for the good, and you put all the consciousness on the good. And Max Heindel would have loved this aspect of this man. Max Heindel even liked Pollyanna, because it was never giving up on looking for the good, which is necessary if you're going to be initiated. You start looking at the dark things, and you're an initiate, you're going to attract entities that are going to try and down you very quickly. The people loved it. His followers grew in number, and none of them suffered what the scoffers said. Now, there is nothing in this horoscope to indicate a huge success by looking for the good. What this means is that it is possible to get beyond your stars with just a simple principle. And that positivity is, it's infectious, it's healthy, and it allows people to do what they want to do. So his life is a testimony that you can have a really hard destiny and you can get beyond it. He died peacefully in his sleep, and he lived beyond his horoscope. So we'll close with the Rosicrucian student's prayer. O God, increase our love for Thee, so that we may serve Thee better from day to day. Let the words of our mouths and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in Thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
So how old did he live to be?
What?
How old did he live to be?
I didn't write that down. I looked it over, but I didn't write it down. He lived at a ripe old age.
90 or so.
Yeah. He doesn't seem like a cheerful, avuncular person. You can go to YouTube and you can listen to his sermons. You see him right there. They videoed a lot of his sermons, but he was positive, and he didn't give up. And for him, positivity was a fact. If you listen to the sermons, it was factual, the way he approached life.
So whenever you're having a very hard time in life, is Saturn somewhere there in your chart?
Boy, that's pretty much of a generalization that I couldn't say. Saturn is probably the most common malefic, and Saturn's sun aspects are the most difficult, at least that I've found. I have a friend right now who has Saturn's sun retrograde at birth, and it's between the second house and the 8th house. And Saturn, by progression, very, very slowly is coming to the exact opposition. And I'm watching the person shut down, and everything that I try, I cannot bring that person up and out of the situation. It is really, really, it's painful. I have been, with these talks, I haven't taken the time to call, but I usually call once or twice a week. But it's a hard destiny. With Saturn's in the 8th house, and every masculine figure that she has loved in life has died. Her husband was hit by a train, and her son died of emaciation after cocaine addiction, and her beloved astrology teacher died, and she almost felt that she was a black widow, that everyone that she partnered with she killed, or you get a feeling of guilt anytime there's a death. We all share what is called original sin, And because of that, when people die and when people suffer, we all feel guilt because we're all in this together. And for some people, there is a stronger identification with those negative things, and that's what it is with this person. But we want to end on a positive note.
I feel like I'm still alive today.
What?
I've totally fallen over.
Everything is well.
What?
Everything is well.
Yeah. All things work for the good. So how is your brother?
Well, let's hope all things work for the good.
What?
They're just going to send him home for hospice and palliative care.
Okay.
And,
So you'll be toddling up there on a regular basis?
yeah.
Were you real close as kids?
Well, we were the only two.
What?
We were the only two siblings, and we were 18 months apart in age.
How many years did you say?
18 months.
18 months, wow.
Yes,
Yeah.
we were close.
Yeah.
But as far as, and he's opposite me in the zodiac. He's a Pisces and a Virgo. So I feel close to him. I'm very close to him, and yet I can't say that we have ever run in the same circles.
Okay.
So
It's not good to run in circles anyway.
yeah, that's true.
I'm not close with my brother. Not at all. We try to be close, but we're just, I don't know, I guess we're both stubborn krauts.
He's been through a tremendous amount of hell, but he still has a marvelous smile.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah, I don't know that I would go to my brother's funeral service.
Really?
And I don't want a memorial service if I go first. He's 84. So
You don't want?
what?
You don't want a memorial service? About all the people that are here.
All the people need to believe in what we've been studying all our life. If they want to see me, they can leave their body and come and see me.
Or tell while you're still alive.
Not everybody's that advanced, my friend.
Yeah.
We can have a
Besides,
celebrate your life.
I am one of those people that's uncomfortable with praise, and I wouldn't want to come from the other side to a memorial service and hear everybody saying good things about me. And then there's always the possibility they might be saying other things too.
Then we have to make an effort to say bad things that we you can't.
Well, it was hard for me to think about traveling, for 10 days.
Yeah.
But I learned that he's planning on cremation.
Okay.
So that,
Will they get his 3.5 days?
yeah, I've got the brochure in an envelope. I'm ready to address it.
Okay.
Oh, the interesting thing that happened when I went to visit him is my sister-in-law's best friend came to visit him, and we were talking about things, and I said, well, about where he is at with his beliefs and so forth. We were standing out in the hallway, and she said, and I told her a little bit, and then I said, well, the conference I'm going to is a Rosicrucian one. Oh, Rosicrucian, she said. And I said, yeah. And she said, well, back in the 70s, I worked in the tuberculosis sanatorium, and I met this interesting man, and I don't remember his name, but it's written in the book that he gave me, and it's the Rosicrucian Conception.
Oh, yes.
And I couldn't believe, that there I was.
She has a Cosmo.
Yeah, she's got a copy of the Cosmos. So and she's an animal lover that has a farm and does the whole farm herself. She's a widow. And, the interesting people you meet at the most...
It's surprising
times.
how we are known in different ways.
Yes.
When I got involved with the Rosicrucian Fellowship, my father checked with all of his Masonic buddies, and I came home to visit, and he said, "That's a nice organization, but those people fight with each other all the time." He knew it in little Mayville, Wisconsin, with no contact with anything.
Well, this gentleman that she remembered, she almost, the tuberculosis sanatorium, my grandmother worked at too. And it's on a hill, and it's a very steep hill, and there's a sidewalk that, comes in a big curve around down. Anyway, she almost lost this man in his wheelchair on the hill. And,
well, I got the 3.5 days I got for both my father, my mother, and my sister, and I'm working on my brother, but it's like a stone wall.
That's the way my brother is.
I said, I told him, you can have your church service and everything, just have it 3.5 days after. Yeah. And, I don't even care if you don't cremate, but give that 3.5 days. And the last comment from my brother was, well, there are different views about what happens at death. Yeah. He's read the Cosmic Conception. Yeah. It was a difficult thing because when I was young, he considered me crazy. He might still consider me crazy. And how do you say it? The kids, he would never let, the kids loved me. And he never let the kids play with me if we'd be at our parents' cottage or something like that. He said I would come from Madison and they would be coming from Chippewa Falls or wherever he was teaching at the time. And he'd tell the kids going across the state, don't listen too much to Uncle Richard, he's crazy. And we never really got along. And he was very strict with his children, and his daughter didn't like being repressed by his strictness, and she was a bedwetter. And then she grew up and got married, and there were all kinds of recriminations between them. And the daughter took a pistol and blew her brains out.
Oh my God.
And he said, who else have I not listened to? Because we have, in our family, we have this, I just had a thing with a friend. I got a conversation with my brother where he talked for 5 minutes straight, and then it was my turn to respond, and before I got a half a sentence out of my mouth, he turned his head and walked away. Mm-hmm. We have that kind of abrupt thing. We're not touchy-feely, intimate kinds of people. And, but at any rate, he never listened to me. And then when she committed suicide, then he read the Cosmic Conception and actually took notes and asked for follow-up information on this and that. But as time went on, he relapsed back into his stone coldness. It's a really interesting chart. It is Uranus in the last degree of Aries, conjoined to Mars in Taurus, conjoined to Sun in Taurus, conjoined to the Ascendant in Taurus.
Sounds like a bullfighter with a red flag.
Yeah, explosive. Yeah. Explosive.
Yeah.
But that Taurus, that's the stonewalling kind of consciousness.
It was last degrees of Aries or Taurus?
What?
Yeah.
Him. When you were talking about his chart,
yeah.
You say something about his...
Uranus was in the last degree of Aries.
Aries.
Yeah, because that's where it is now.
Yeah.
So his chart
what year was that?
Pretty heavily.
Yeah. What year?
He's 4.5 years older than I am. So I'm 38, and so that would make him 34. 1934, 1933.
Well, anyway, I figured out how you get that 3.5 days for someone. You come to Richard's class, because if you remember, 8 years ago, I was at your place, got there late Sunday night, and very early Tuesday morning, I got a phone call from the hospital, and my mother died, and I did not go back immediately. I didn't want to go back immediately, and so I stood out on the corner wherever I could get any phone reception and made arrangements and said, well, it's going to take me a while to get back from Madison.
Yes.
So I managed to get the 3.5 days.
Yes.
by coming to Madison and not being there. And for my husband, I kind of stayed up at the lake a while and stuff, and they told me, well, in the Orthodox Church, they usually try to have them buried before 3 days. I said, I don't care. I want the 3.5 days. And so I bought it for both of them. And my mother, by the way, was a Taurus. And I never discussed it with her, because if I would have discussed it, she would have had something written to make sure that she had something different. So by not discussing it and by being gone, and she was, so in death I won. In death I got what I wanted for her.
Yeah.
That's how you do it. You come to your class.
If you need a difficult chart,
our life here is so precious, and the experience, if you try to do retrospection, you see things in your daily experiences that have all kinds of different ramifications. And that's just a poor quality trying to do retrospection, and what it must be like after death, where you can process all the different angles that impinge on your life. So
she was 91, so you want that time, because she died on a Tuesday, and the funeral was on a Saturday. So I think I insisted that they keep her cold before they do any, what do you call it?
Embalming.
Yeah. And so the funeral parlor thing would have been Friday or whatever, but she died real early Tuesday morning, like 7:15. Anyway, I did my best. I did for her in her death what I couldn't do for her in her life. It's okay. But that's the trick. Go out of town to Richard's class.